The black sludge bubbles through the basement floor of 97th Street Elementary School, pooling beneath desks where 7-year-olds practice arithmetic. Its chemical stench so powerful that teachers keep windows open even in January's sub-zero temperatures. Children splash through rainbow-colored puddles during recess, their skin burning where the liquid touches, their clothes dissolving at the seams from acids that weren't supposed to exist in a schoolyard. By spring of 1978, Lois Gibbs counts 17 miscarriages among her neighbors on 101st Street alone, watches children born with 2 rows of teeth, extra fingers, organs outside their bodies. The lawns of Love Canal glow phosphorescent at night. Basement walls weep chemicals that eat through concrete, and still the Niagara Falls School Board insists nothing is wrong, that the 21,000 tons of toxic waste buried directly beneath this suburban paradise pose no threat to the 800 families who built their American dream atop an industrial graveyard. Hooker Chemical Corporation's internal memos, hidden for decades, reveal they knew exactly what they buried here. Dioxin levels 100,000 times safe limits, benzene that causes leukemia, lindane that destroys nervous systems. They knew when they sold the land for $1. They knew when they watched families move in. They knew when children began to die. And they kept silent, protected by laws written to shield corporations from consequences, while Love Canal transformed from neighborhood to necropolis. Karen Schroeder's daughter develops chemical burns simply from playing in her own backyard, the skin peeling off her hands in sheets. The family dog dies after drinking from a puddle, its internal organs liquefied by acids that shouldn't exist in nature. When Karen digs a small hole to plant tomatoes, the shovel strikes a soft spot and releases a geyser of black fluid that burns through the metal blade. The tomatoes that grow are monstrous, misshapen things with tumors larger than the fruit itself. Her neighbor, Marie Posniak, gives birth to a child with a heart outside its chest cavity. Another neighbor's son develops a rare liver cancer that appears in 1 in 4 million children. By 1978, every third house on 99th Street has experienced a miscarriage, stillbirth, or child with birth defects. The New York State Health Department's initial response is to recommend that pregnant women avoid basements and that children not eat dirt, as if these minimal precautions could shield families from 21,000 tons of mutagenic chemicals seeping through every pore of the earth. The first mystery crystallizes in the land's history. Love Canal was literally that, a canal dug in the 1890s by William T. Love, intended to connect the upper and lower Niagara River for hydroelectric power. When the project failed, Hooker Chemical Corporation acquired the abandoned canal in 1942 and transformed it into an industrial waste dump. For 11 years, they buried drums containing every toxic nightmare their factories produced: pesticides, plasticizers, caustics, and most lethally, dioxin, the component of Agent Orange that would later destroy lives in Vietnam. In 1953, after filling the canal with 21,000 tons of chemical waste, Hooker covered it with clay and sold it to the Niagara Falls School Board for exactly $1. The deed contained a disclaimer absolving Hooker of all future liability, a single paragraph that would later shield them from responsibility for thousands of destroyed lives. The silence wasn't accidental, but orchestrated. When the school board broke ground in 1954, construction workers reported hitting chemical drums just 4 feet below the surface. The stench was so overwhelming that several workers required hospitalization. Hooker Chemical representatives attended the groundbreaking, watched the drums being punctured, said nothing. When homes were built directly atop the dump site, Hooker executives toured the neighborhood, took photographs, documented in internal memos that direct residential construction over the chemical dump presents substantial liability risks, then filed these memos away. When children reported chemical burns from playing in the schoolyard, when pets began dying in unprecedented numbers, when miscarriage rates soared to 3 times the national average, Hooker's response was strategic silence. They had legally transferred liability with that $1 sale. The families of Love Canal were on their own. Suspicion grows when examining the government's response timeline. The first official complaints about chemical odors and health problems were filed in 1976. The Niagara Gazette began investigating in 1977, with reporter Michael Brown documenting a terrifying pattern of illness. Yet the New York State Health Department didn't conduct soil tests until 1978, and even then, only after massive public pressure, when the tests revealed benzene levels 250 times safe limits, pesticide concentrations that defied measurement, and dioxin at levels that should have triggered immediate evacuation. The state's response was to recommend prudent avoidance of basements. It took Lois Gibbs, organizing the Love Canal Homeowners Association, conducting their own health surveys, and presenting evidence of a childhood illness rate 56% above normal before any official action was contemplated. Even then, the initial evacuation order covered only pregnant women and children under 2. as if toxic chemicals respected age boundaries. The launch of investigation reveals the true scope of the contamination. The EPA's testing found 82 different chemical compounds in the air, water, and soil of Love Canal, many of which had never been tested for human toxicity because they were never supposed to exist outside industrial processes. Lindane, a pesticide banned for its neurotoxic effects, was found at concentrations that killed laboratory equipment. Trichlorophenol, which causes chloracin and liver damage, had leached into the groundwater system that supplied drinking water to thousands. Most terrifying was the discovery of TCDD dioxin, the most toxic synthetic chemical ever created, at levels that classified Love Canal as more contaminated than some Superfund sites. The chemicals hadn't stayed contained beneath the clay cap. They had migrated through underground swales, following old stream beds, contaminating an area far beyond the original dump site. The first discovery emerges from basement air sampling. The toxic vapors weren't just present. They were actively entering homes through foundation cracks, turning basements into gas chambers. Families were being poisoned in their sleep, children developing leukemias and lymphomas from simply breathing in their own homes. The chemicals had created their own underground rivers, following paths of least resistance, surfacing in patterns that defied prediction. Some homes showed no contamination, while houses next door registered levels that should have killed all occupants. The randomness made the terror worse. No family knew if their home was safe or if their children were breathing carcinogens with every breath. Testing equipment often failed because the chemical concentrations exceeded anything the instruments were designed to measure. The expansion of scope reveals corporate knowledge that implicates an entire industry. Hooker Chemical wasn't alone in knowing about Love Canal's dangers. Internal documents from Occidental Petroleum, which acquired Hooker in 1968, show full awareness of the substantial liability potential of the site. Insurance companies had refused to cover Hooker for environmental damage claims as early as 1960, suggesting industry-wide knowledge of the looming catastrophe. The Army Corps of Engineers had surveyed the area in 1971 and noted suspicious chemical odors and surface irregularities consistent with subsurface contamination, but classified their report. Multiple government agencies possessed information that could have prevented families from moving to Love Canal, but none acted. The silence was systemic, protecting corporate interests over human lives. The clash with established knowledge comes in the health effects. Medical science in 1978 had no framework for understanding multi-chemical exposure syndrome. Doctors were trained to recognize poisoning from single chemicals, not the cocktail of 82 different compounds interacting in ways that multiplied their toxicity. Children presented with symptoms that didn't match any known disease: seizures combined with chemical burns, cognitive impairment paired with organ failure, cancers that appeared in organs that shouldn't develop cancer in children. The Love Canal residents were experiencing something medicine had no name for: environmental genocide in slow motion. Traditional toxicology assumed that dilution meant safety, but Love Canal proved that chemicals could bioaccumulate, that chronic low-level exposure could be more dangerous than acute poisoning, that the human body could become a repository for industrial waste. The second layer mystery deepens with genetic evidence. Children born in Love Canal showed chromosome damage that shouldn't have been survivable. Studies found that 33% of children had chromosome aberrations compared to 1% in the general population. These weren't just random mutations, but specific patterns of damage that suggested exposure to mutagenic chemicals during fetal development. Women who had lived in Love Canal during pregnancy gave birth to children with birth defects, even after moving away, indicating that the chemicals had altered their very genetic material. The damage was inheritable. The third generation, grandchildren of Love Canal residents, showed elevated rates of learning disabilities, autoimmune disorders, and cancers. Hooker Chemical hadn't just poisoned a neighborhood, they had corrupted the human genome itself. The mapping of contamination reveals deliberate deception in the canal's construction. Hooker hadn't simply dumped chemicals randomly, but had created a sophisticated disposal system designed to hide the waste's extent. They had dug lateral trenches extending from the main canal, creating fingers of contamination that reached far beyond the official dump site. They had layered different types of waste strategically, placing the most toxic materials at depths that would avoid casual detection, while ensuring they would eventually leach into groundwater. Most damning, they had removed natural clay barriers that would have contained the chemicals, replacing them with porous fill that guaranteed migration. This wasn't negligent disposal, but engineered contamination, designed to disperse the evidence over time. The central paradox manifests in the evacuation decision. President Carter's emergency declaration in August 1978 authorized the evacuation of 239 families, but only those living directly adjacent to the canal. The decision created an arbitrary line. Families on one side of the street were evacuated, while their neighbors across the street were told their homes were safe. This inner ring and outer ring designation ignored the underground migration patterns of chemicals, the wind-borne dispersal of toxins, the interconnected water systems that spread contamination throughout the neighborhood. Families in the outer ring showed the same health problems, the same chromosome damage, the same cancer clusters, but were denied evacuation because admitting the full extent of contamination would have implicated the entire American chemical industry in similar sites nationwide. The structural mechanism of the cover-up involved every level of government. Local officials who had approved home construction over the dump site destroyed meeting minutes that would have revealed their knowledge. State health officials manipulated statistics, comparing Love Canal disease rates to national averages instead of local controls, diluting the apparent impact. Federal agencies delayed testing, restricted access to results, and classified reports that showed contamination levels exceeding anything previously documented in residential areas. The media was managed through selective information releases, technical jargon that obscured meanings, and strategic timing of announcements to minimize coverage. When residents conducted their own health surveys, showing cancer rates 50% above normal, officials dismissed them as anecdotal and unscientific, even as their own suppressed data confirmed the residents' findings. The dual realities compared reveal two love canals: the official version where a minor chemical leak caused temporary inconvenience, and the true version where an entire community was deliberately sacrificed to protect corporate profits. In the official version, 239 families were evacuated as a precaution. Compensation was provided, the site was remediated. In reality, over 1,000 families were exposed to lethal chemicals. Hundreds developed cancers. Countless children were born with defects, or never born at all, and the genetic damage continues through generations. The official version claims Hooker Chemical followed accepted disposal practices of the era. The reality shows they knew exactly how dangerous their waste was, chose the site specifically because it would become residential, and calculated that legal protections would shield them from consequences. The hypothesis forms through accumulated evidence. Love Canal was not an accident, but an experiment. The chemical industry needed to know what would happen when their waste interacted with human populations over time. Love Canal provided a controlled study, a known quantity of specific chemicals, a defined population, measurable outcomes. The $1 sale wasn't just liability transfer, but the purchase of human test subjects. The delayed response, the limited evacuation, the ongoing monitoring, all consistent with observing an experiment rather than managing a disaster. Internal Hooker documents reference Love Canal as a field laboratory and discuss population exposure models that would inform future disposal strategies. The families weren't victims of negligence, but subjects in a deliberate test of chemical warfare on American soil. Contradictory evidence surfaces in the remediation efforts. The official cleanup, completed in 1990 at a cost of $250 million, supposedly removed all contaminated soil and installed an impermeable cap. Yet independent testing in 2000 found chemical levels in some areas higher than before remediation. The explanation defies logic unless the contamination source was never fully identified. Deep boring samples suggest the chemicals didn't just fill the canal but penetrated bedrock, creating reservoirs of toxins that continue to leach upward. The remediation may have been theater, designed to create the appearance of solution while knowing the problem was unsolvable. Occidental Petroleum's continued monitoring of the site, spending millions annually on testing they claim shows safety, suggests they know something remains that requires watching. The global context emerges through the proliferation of love canals worldwide. Within 5 years of the evacuation, similar sites were discovered in Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, California, each with the same pattern of chemical companies disposing waste where residential development was planned, transferring liability through legal mechanisms, then remaining silent as communities sickened. The Love Canal model became a template: create plausible deniability through property transfers, ensure legal protection through disclaimer clauses, wait for statutes of limitations to expire. By 1980, the EPA had identified 15,000 potential love canals across America, each a ticking chemical bomb beneath unsuspecting communities. The global chemical industry had turned the planet into a waste dump, and Love Canal had shown them they could get away with it. The inner reflection reveals the psychological transformation of Love Canal residents. Beyond physical illness came existential trauma, the realization that their government would knowingly allow them to be poisoned. that corporations valued profit over their children's lives, that the American dream could be built on a lie. Many survivors developed what psychiatrists termed environmental trauma syndrome, a combination of PTSD, survivor guilt, and chronic anxiety that persisted long after evacuation. They could never again trust that their food was safe, their water clean, their air breathable. Every headache might be cancer, every pregnancy a potential tragedy, every childhood illness a death sentence. Hooker Chemical hadn't just poisoned their bodies, but had corrupted their ability to feel safe in the world. The climax arrives with the 1980 chromosome study that forced President Carter to order complete evacuation. Dr. Beverly Pagen's research showed that Love Canal residents had suffered genetic damage equivalent to atomic bomb survivors. The implications were catastrophic. An American corporation had inflicted Hiroshima-level cellular destruction on American citizens, on American soil, in peacetime. The study was immediately classified, released only in partial form, with key data redacted. But the damage was done. The public learned that American industry could commit genetic warfare against American families and face no criminal consequences. Occidental Petroleum paid settlements that averaged $35,000 per family, the price of an American life in the chemical age. The consequences cascade through environmental law and public health. Love Canal forced the creation of the Superfund program, acknowledging that America was covered in toxic waste sites, requiring billions in cleanup. It revealed that 50 million Americans lived within 4 miles of a dangerous chemical dump. It exposed the fiction of regulatory protection, showing that agencies tasked with public safety consistently prioritized corporate interests. Most fundamentally, it shattered the assumption that American soil was safe, that suburban communities were protected from industrial violence. Every American backyard became potentially suspect, every playground possibly poisoned, every home potentially built on a chemical graveyard. Parallel evidence emerges from the ongoing health monitoring of Love Canal evacuees. 40 years later, they show cancer rates 300% above normal, autoimmune disorders at epidemic levels, reproductive problems spanning generations. Their children and grandchildren carry genetic markers of a chemical exposure, biological scarlet letters that identify them as Love Canal descendants. Medical studies track increased rates of learning disabilities, behavioral disorders, and developmental delays that correlate with their parents' proximity to the canal. The poisoning didn't end with evacuation, but traveled through time, encoded in DNA, a toxic inheritance that makes Love Canal not a historical event, but an ongoing catastrophe measured in generations of damaged lives. The return to the core question brings rage at deliberate evil. Why did Hooker Chemical bury 21,000 tons of lethal waste, knowing it would become a residential neighborhood? Because they could. Because the law protected them. Because American capitalism valued their profits over human lives. Because they calculated correctly that even if discovered, the consequences would be financial, not criminal. No Hooker executive went to prison. The company paid settlements that represented a fraction of profits earned from the chemicals they buried. They continue to operate, now as Occidental Petroleum, one of America's largest corporations. The message was clear. Corporations can commit mass poisoning and face only monetary penalties that shareholders absorb as business expenses. The temporal reevaluation reveals Love Canal as prophecy, not history. The chemicals buried in 1942 and 1953 were from the first generation of synthetic toxins. Since then, the chemical industry has created 80,000 new compounds, most never tested for human safety. Each year, 1,000 new chemicals enter commerce, their long-term effects unknown. We are all Love Canal now, living atop and within a global experiment in chemical exposure. The average American carries 200 synthetic chemicals in their bloodstream that didn't exist before 1950. Cancer rates, autoimmune disorders, reproductive failures, genetic damage, all increasing in patterns that mirror Love Canal's survivors. The canal was the prototype. We are the full-scale implementation. The reconstruction of truth through survivor testimony reveals heroes abandoned by history. Lois Gibbs, who transformed from housewife to environmental activist, forcing the government to act through relentless organizing. Beverly Pagen, whose scientific courage in documenting chromosome damage cost her career but saved thousands of lives. Michael Brown, whose journalism broke through corporate silence. The Love Canal Homeowners Association, ordinary families who fought the chemical industry and won partial victory. These people, dismissed as hysterical, alarmist, unscientific, were right about everything. Their ignored warnings echo through every cancer ward, every special education classroom, every fertility clinic where Love Canal's legacy continues to claim victims. The true purpose unveils itself in the precedent established. Love Canal taught corporations that environmental genocide carries minimal risk if executed properly. Structure liability transfers correctly, maintain plausible deniability, capture regulatory agencies, and mass poisoning becomes a manageable business expense. The $250 million remediation cost sounds substantial until compared to Hooker's chemical profits over decades. The precedent was clear. Poisoning communities is profitable if you follow Love Canal's template. This is why similar sites exist everywhere, why chemical exposure is now universal, why cancer has become normalized. Love Canal wasn't a failure of the system, but the system working as designed, protecting capital, sacrificing citizens. The scientific analysis of current Love Canal samples reveals the lie of remediation. The site, declared safe in 2004, still contains chemicals at levels that would trigger evacuation if discovered today. The containment system is failing, with recent tests showing increasing contamination in surrounding areas. The monitoring wells that should track chemical migration have been mysteriously vandalized or decommissioned. Occidental Petroleum continues to claim the site is safe while spending millions on liability insurance that wouldn't be necessary if their claims were true. The chemicals wait patiently underground, following geological time, knowing that all human structures fail, that what was buried will surface, that Love Canal's poisoning has only paused, not ended. The validation of authenticity comes from the bodies, the cancers that cluster in statistical impossibility, the birth defects that match chemical signatures, the chromosome damage that identifies victims decades later, the death certificates that pile up, each a testament to corporate murder. The science is unequivocal. Love Canal residents were poisoned by Hooker Chemicals waste. The causation is proven, the responsibility is clear. Yet Occidental Petroleum trades on the New York Stock Exchange. Its executives retire with fortunes, its shareholders profit from dividends earned through death. This is not conspiracy but documented fact, not speculation but proven history, not accusation but confession written in chemical formulae that spell genocide. The motive for concealment transcends corporate liability. Love Canal revealed that American industry had turned the nation into a toxic waste dump, that millions lived atop chemical time bombs, that the government knew and did nothing. Full disclosure would have triggered nationwide panic, thousands of evacuations, trillions in cleanup costs, the collapse of the chemical industry, and fundamental questioning of industrial capitalism itself. The cover-up protected not just Hooker Chemical, but the entire system that prioritizes production over life, profit over people, growth over survival. Love Canal had to be minimized, contained, forgotten, because remembering would require acknowledging that American prosperity is built on poisoned ground. The philosophical collapse arrives with recognition that Love Canal represents the logical endpoint of treating Earth as commodity rather than home. When land becomes property, when nature becomes resource, when communities become markets, then burying poison beneath playgrounds becomes rational business practice. The families of Love Canal weren't victims of accident, but of ideology, poisoned not just by chemicals, but by the belief system that made burying those chemicals seem reasonable. Every sick child, every grieving parent, every broken family was a sacrifice to the god of profit, offerings on the altar of industrial progress. The closing echo resonates through every American community built on compromised ground, where children play above invisible toxins, where families sleep over chemical nightmares, where the American dream rests on foundations of industrial waste. Love Canal isn't history but preview, not exception but rule, not warning but prophecy being fulfilled. The black sludge that bubbled through basement floors in 1978 was the truth of American industrial civilization, breaking through comfortable lies, revealing that we have built our society on poison and called it progress. Hooker Chemical still operates. The chemicals still spread. The children still sicken. The cancers still grow. And in boardrooms across America, executives still calculate the profitable balance between poisoning and profit, knowing that Love Canal proved they can kill with impunity as long as they follow the proper forms, file the right papers, transfer the liability. The town that turned into a graveyard wasn't buried by chemical waste, but by the system that made poisoning communities a legitimate business model, a system that continues today, creating new Love Canals, faster than we can discover the old ones, ensuring that somewhere in America tonight, a child is playing in a yard that glows with the same phosphorescent death that claimed Love Canal, the cycle continuing because we learned the wrong lesson. Not that poisoning communities is evil, but that getting caught is expensive.